Chapter 22 Alone. The idea of spiritual life must be innate in the heart of man, for all that terrible night, when the children lay huddled together in the little hut in the chapel, the fear that filled them was that their old friend may suddenly darken the entrance and seek to lie down beside them. They did not speak about him. Something had been done to him. Something had happened. Something terrible had happened to the world they knew, but they dared not speak of it or question each other. Dick had carried his companion to the hut when he left the boat, and hidden with her there. The evening had come on, and the night, and now in the darkness, without having tasted food all day, he was telling her not to be afraid, that he would take care of her. But not a word of the thing that had happened. The thing, for them, had no precedent and no vocabulary. They had come across death raw and real, uncooked by religion, undeodorized by the sayings of sages and poets. They knew nothing of the philosophy that tells us that death is the common lot and the natural sequence to birth, or the religion that teaches us that death is the door to life. A dead old sailor man lying like a festering carcass on a coral ledge, eyes staring and glazed and fixed, a wide-open mouth that once had spoken comforting words, and now spoke living crabs. That was the vision before them. They did not philosophize about it, and though they were filled with terror, I do not think it was terror that held them from speaking about it, but a vague feeling that what they had beheld was obscene, unspeakable, and a thing to avoid. Lestrange had brought them up in his own way. He had told them there was a good God who looked after the world, determined as far as he could to exclude demonology and sin and death from their knowledge. He had rested content with the bald statement that there was a good God who looked after the world, without explaining fully that the same God would torture them forever and ever, should they fail to believe in him or keep his commandments. This knowledge of the Almighty, therefore, was but a half-knowledge, the vaguest abstraction. Had they been brought up, however, in the most strictly Calvinistic school, this knowledge of him would have been no comfort now. Belief in God is no comfort to a frightened child. Teach him as many parrot-like prayers as you please, and in distress or the dark of what use are they to him? His cry is for his nurse or his mother. During that dreadful night these two children had no comfort to seek anywhere in the whole wide universe but in each other. She, in a sense of his protection, he, in a sense of being her protector. The manliness in him greater and more beautiful than physical strength, developed in those dark hours just as a plant under extraordinary circumstances is hurried into bloom. Towards dawn Emmeline fell asleep. Dick stole out of the hut when he had assured himself from her regular breathing that she was asleep, and pushing the tendrils and the branches of the mammy apples aside, found the beach. The dawn was just breaking, and the morning breeze was coming in from the sea. When he had beached the dinghy the day before, the tide was just at the flood, and it had left her stranded. The tide was coming in now, and in a short time it would be far enough up to push her off. Emmeline in the night had implored him to take her away somewhere from there, and he had promised, without knowing in the least how he was to perform his promise. As he stood looking at the beach, so desolate and strangely different now from what it was the day before, an idea of how he could fulfill his promise came to him. He ran down to where the little boat lay on the shelving sand, with the ripples of the incoming tide just washing the rudder, which was still shipped. He unshipped the rudder and came back. Under a tree, covered with the staysail they had brought from the Shenandoah, lay most of their treasures, old clothes and boots, and all the other odds and ends. The precious tobacco stitched up in a piece of canvas was there, and the housewife with the needles and threads. A hole had been dug in the sand as a sort of cache for them, and the staysail put over them to protect them from the dew. Chapter 23 They move away. He began to collect the things and carry them to the dinghy. He took the staysail and everything that may be useful, and when he had stowed them in the boat, he took the breaker and filled it with water at the water source in the wood. He collected some bananas and breadfruit, and stowed them in the dinghy with the breaker. Then he found the remains of yesterday's breakfast, which he had hidden between two palmetto leaves, and placed it also in the boat. The water was now so high that a strong push would float her. He turned back to the hut for Emmeline. She was still asleep, so soundly asleep that when he lifted her up in his arms she made no movement. He placed her carefully in the stern sheets with her head on the sail rolled up, and then standing in the bow pushed off with the scull. Then, taking the sculls, he turned the boat's head up the lagoon to the left. He kept close to the shore, but for the life of him he could not help lifting his eyes and looking towards the reef. Round a certain spot on the distant white coral there was a great commotion of birds. Huge birds some of them seemed, and the high of them came across the lagoon on the breeze as they quarreled together and beat the air with their wings. He turned his head away till a bend of the shore hid the spot from sight. Here, sheltered more completely than opposite the break in the reef, the ardu trees came in places right down to the water's edge. The breadfruit trees cast the shadow of their great scalloped leaves upon the water. Glades, thick with fern, wildernesses of the mamia apple, and bushes of the scarlet, wild coconut, all slipped by as the dinghy, hugging the shore, crept up the lagoon. Gazing at the shore edge one may have imagined it the edge of a lake, but for the thunder of the Pacific upon the distant reef, an evening that did not destroy the impression but only lent a strangeness to it. A lake in the amid of the ocean, that is what the lagoon really was. Here and there coconut trees slanted over the water, mirroring their delicate stems, and tracing their clear-cut shadows on the sandy bottom a fathom deep below. He kept close inshore for the sake of the shelter of the trees. His object was to find some place where they may stop permanently and put up a tent. He was seeking a new home, in fact, but pretty as were the glades they passed, they were not attractive places to live in. There were too many trees, or the ferns were too deep. He was seeking air and space, and suddenly he found it. Rounding a little cape, all blazing with the scarlet of the wild coconut, the dinghy broke into a new world. Before her lay a great sweep of the palest blue wind-swept water, down to which came a broad green sward of park-like land set on either side with deep groves, and leading up and away to higher land, where, above the massive and motionless green of the great breadfruit trees, the palm trees swayed and fluttered their pale green feathers in the breeze. The pale color of the water was due to the extreme shallowness of the lagoon just here. So shallow was it that one could see brown spaces indicating beds of dead and rotten coral, and splashes of darkest sapphire where the deep pools lay. The reef lay more than half a mile from the shore, a great way out, it seemed, so far out that its cramping influence was removed, and one had the impression of wide and unbroken sea. Dick rested on his oars, and let the dinghy float whilst he looked around him. He had come some 4 miles and a half, and this was right at the back of the island. Chapter 1. Under the ardu tree, on the edge of the green sward, between a diamond-checkered ardu trunk and the massive bowl of a breadfruit, a house had come into being. It was not much larger than a big hen house, but quite sufficient for the needs of 2 people in a climate of eternal summer. It was built of bamboos and thatched with a double thatch of palmetto leaves, so neatly built and so well thatched that one may have fancied it the production of several skilled workmen. The breadfruit tree was barren of fruit, as these trees sometimes are, whole groves of them ceasing to bear for some mysterious reason only known to nature. It was green now, but, when suffering its yearly change, the great scalloped leaves would take all imaginable tinges of gold and bronze and amber. Beyond the ardu was a little clearing, where the chaparral had been carefully removed, and taro roots planted. Stepping from the house doorway onto the sward you may have fancied yourself, except for the tropical nature of the foliage, in some English park. Looking to the right, the eye became lost in the woods, where all tints of green were tinging the foliage, and the bushes of the wild coconut burned scarlet as hawberries. The house had a doorway, but no door. It may have been said to have a double roof, for the breadfruit foliage above gave good shelter during the rains. Inside it was bare enough. Dried, sweet-smelling ferns covered the floor. 2 sails, rolled up, lay on either side of the doorway. There was a rude shelf attached to one of the walls, and on the shelf some bowls made of coconut shell. The people to whom the place belonged evidently did not trouble it much with their presence, using it only at night, and as a refuge from the dew. Sitting on the grass by the doorway, sheltered by the breadfruit shade, yet with the hot rays of the afternoon sun just touching her naked feet, was a girl of 15 or 16, naked, except for a kilt of gaily striped material reaching from her waist to her knees. Her long black hair was drawn back from the forehead and tied behind with a loop of the elastic vine. A scarlet blossom was stuck behind her right ear, after the fashion of a clerk's pen. Her face was beautiful, powdered with tiny freckles, especially under the eyes, which were of a deep, tranquil blue-gray. She half sat, half lay on her left side, whilst before her, quite close, strutted up and down on the grass, a bird with blue plumage, coral-red beak, and bright, watchful eyes. The girl was Emmeline Lestrange. Just by her elbow stood a little bowl made from half a cocoanut, and filled with some white substance with which she was feeding the bird. Dick had found it in the woods 2 years ago, quite small, deserted by its mother and starving. They had fed it and tamed it, and it was now one of the family, roosting on the roof at night, and appearing regularly at meal times. All at once she held out her hand. The bird flew into the air, lit on her forefinger, and balanced itself, sinking its head between its shoulders, and uttering the sound which formed its entire vocabulary and one means of vocal expression, a sound from which it had derived its name. "Coco," said Emmeline, "where is Dick?" The bird turned his head about, as if he were searching for his master, and the girl lay back lazily on the grass, laughing, and holding him up poised on her finger, as if he were some enameled jewel she wished to admire at a little distance. They made a pretty picture under the cave-like shadow of the breadfruit leaves, and it was difficult to understand how this young girl, so perfectly formed, so fully developed, and so beautiful, had evolved from plain little Emmeline Lestrange. Chapter 2. Half Child, Half Savage. 5 rainy seasons had passed and gone since the tragic occurrence on the reef. 5 long years the breakers had thundered, and the seagulls had cried round the figure whose spell had drawn a mysterious barrier across the lagoon. The children had never returned to the old place. They had kept entirely to the back of the island and the woods, the lagoon, down to a certain point, and the reef, a wide enough and beautiful enough world, but a hopeless world as far as help from civilization was concerned. For, of the few ships that touched at the island in the course of years, how many would explore the lagoon or woods? Perhaps not one. Occasionally Dick would make an excursion in the dinghy to the old place, but Emmeline refused to accompany him. He went chiefly to obtain bananas, for on the whole island there was but one clump of banana trees, that near the water source in the wood, where the old green skulls had been discovered, and the little barrel. She had never quite recovered from the occurrence on the reef. Something had been shown to her, the purport of which she vaguely understood, and it had filled her with horror and a terror of the place where it had occurred. Dick was quite different. He had been frightened enough at first, but the feeling wore away in time. Dick had built 3 houses in succession during the 5 years. He had laid out a patch of taro and another of sweet potatoes. He knew every pool on the reef for 2 miles either way, and the forms of their inhabitants, and though he did not know the names of the creatures to be found there, he made a profound study of their habits. He had seen some astonishing things during these 5 years, from a fight between a whale and 2 thrashers conducted outside the reef, lasting an hour, and dyeing the breaking waves with blood, to the poisoning of the fish in the lagoon by fresh water, due to an extraordinarily heavy rainy season. He knew the woods of the back of the island by heart, and the forms of life that inhabited them, butterflies and moths and birds, lizards and insects of strange shape, extraordinary orchids, some filthy-looking, the very image of corruption, some beautiful, and all strange. He found melons and guavas and breadfruit, the red apple of Tahiti, and the great Brazilian plum, taro in plenty, and a dozen other good things, but there were no bananas. This made him unhappy at times, for he was human. Though Emmeline had asked Coco for Dick's whereabouts, It was only a remark made by way of making conversation, for she could hear him in the little canebrake which lay close by amidst the trees. In a few minutes Hugh appeared, dragging after him 2 canes which he had just cut, and wiping the perspiration off his brow with his naked arm. He had an old pair of trousers on, part of the truck salved long ago from the Shenandoah, nothing else, and he was well worth looking at and considering, both from a physical and psychological point of view. Auburn-haired and tall, looking more like 17 than 16, with a restless and daring expression, half a child, half a man, half a civilized being, half a savage, he had both progressed and retrograded during the 5 years of savage life. He sat down beside Emmeline, flung the canes beside him, tried the edge of the old butcher's knife with which he had cut them, then, taking one of the canes across his knee, he began whittling at it. "What are you making?" asked Emmeline, releasing the bird, which flew into one of the branches of the ardu and rested there, a blue point amidst the dark green. "Fish spear," replied Dick. Without being taciturn, he rarely wasted words. Life was all business for him. He would talk to Emmeline, but always in short sentences, and he had developed the habit of talking to inanimate things, to the fish spear he was carving, or the bowl he was fashioning from a cocoa-nut. As for Emmeline, evening as a child she had never been talkative. There was something mysterious in her personality, something secretive. Her mind seemed half submerged in twilight. Though she spoke little, and though the subject of their conversations was almost entirely material and relative to their everyday needs, her mind would wander into abstract fields and the land of chimera and dreams. What she found there no one knew, least of all, perhaps, herself. As for Dick, he would sometimes talk and mutter to himself, as if in a reverie, but if you caught the words, you would find that they referred to no abstraction, but to some trifle he had on hand. He seemed entirely bound up in the moment, and to have forgotten the past as completely as though it had never been. Yet he had his contemplative moods. He would lie with his face over a rock pool by the hour, watching the strange forms of life to be seen there, or sit in the woods motionless as a stone, watching the birds and the swift-slipping lizards. The birds came so close that he could easily have knocked them over, but he never hurt one or interfered in any way with the wild life of the woods. The island, the lagoon, and the reef were for him the 3 volumes of a great picture book, as they were for Emmeline, though in a different manner. The color and the beauty of it all fed some mysterious want in her soul. Her life was a long reverie, a beautiful vision, troubled with shadows. Across all the blue and colored spaces that meant months and years she could still see, as in a glass dimly, the Northumberland, smoking against the wild background of fog, her uncle's face, Boston, a vague and dark picture beyond a storm, and nearer, the tragic form on the reef that still haunted terribly her dreams. But she never spoke of these things to Dick, just as she kept the secret of what was in her box, and the secret of her trouble whenever she lost it. She kept the secret of her feelings about these things. Born of these things there remained with her always a vague terror, the terror of losing Dick. Mrs. Stannard, her uncle, the dim people she had known in Boston, all had passed away out of her life like a dream and shadows. The other one too, most horribly. What if Dick were taken from her as well? This haunting trouble had been with her a long time. Up to a few months ago it had been mainly personal and selfish, the dread of being left alone, but lately it had altered and become more acute. Dick had changed in her eyes, and the fear was now for him. Her own personality had suddenly and strangely become merged in his. The idea of life without him was unthinkable, yet the trouble remained a menace in the blue. Some days it would be worse than others. Today, for instance, it was worse than yesterday, as though some danger had crept close to them during the night. Yet the sky and sea were stainless. The sun shone on tree and flower. The west wind brought the tune of the faraway reef like a lullaby. There was nothing to hint of danger or the need of distrust. At last Dick finished his spear and rose to his feet. "Where are you going?" asked Emmeline. "The reef," he replied. "The tide's going out." "I'll go with you," said she. He went into the house and stowed the precious knife away. Then he came out, spear in one hand and half a fathom of liana in the other. The liana was for the purpose of stringing the fish on, should the catch be large. He led the way down the grassy sward to the lagoon where the dinghy lay, close up to the bank, and moored to a post driven into the soft soil. Emmeline got in, and, taking the sculls, he pushed off. The tide was going out. I have said that the reef just here lay a great way out from the shore. The lagoon was so shallow that at low tide one could have waded almost right across it, were it not for potholes here and there, 10 feet traps, and great beds of rotten coral, into which one would sink as into brushwood, to say nothing of the nettle coral that stings like a bed of nettles. There were also other dangers. Tropical shallows are full of wild surprises in the way of life and death. Dick had long ago marked out in his memory the soundings of the lagoon, and it was fortunate that he possessed the special sense of location which is the main standby of the hunter and the savage, for, from the disposition of the coral and ribs, the water from the shore edge to the reef ran in lanes. Only 2 of these lanes gave a clear, fair way from the shore edge to the reef. Had you followed the others, evening in a boat of such shallow draught as the dinghy, you would have found yourself stranded halfway across, unless, truly, it were a spring tide. Halfway across, the sound of the surf on the barrier became louder, and the everlasting and monotonous cry of the gulls came on the breeze. It was lonely out here, and, looking back, the shore seemed a great way off. It was lonelier still on the reef. Dick tied up the boat to a projection of coral and helped Emmeline to land. The sun was creeping down into the west. The tide was nearly half out, and large pools of water lay glittering like burnished shields in the sunlight. Dick, with his precious spear beside him, sat calmly down on a ledge of coral and began to divest himself of his one and only garment. Emmeline turned away her head and contemplated the distant shore, which seemed thrice as far off as it was in reality. When she turned her head again, he was racing along the edge of the surf. He and his spear silhouetted against the spindrift and dazzling foam formed a picture savage enough, and well in keeping with the general desolation of the background. She watched him lie down and cling to a piece of coral, whilst the surf rushed round and over him, and then rise and shake himself like a dog, and pursue his gambols, his body all glittering with the wet. Sometimes a whoop would come on the breeze, mixing with the sound of the surf and the cry of the gulls, and she would see him plunge his spear into a pool, and the next moment the spear would be held aloft with something struggling and glittering at the end of it. He was quite different out here on the reef to what he was ashore. Chapter 3: The Demon of the Reef. The romance of coral has still to be written. There still exists a widespread opinion that the coral reef and the coral island are the work of an insect. This fabulous insect, accredited with the genius of Brunel and the patience of Job, has been humorously enough held up before the children of many generations as an example of industry, a thing to be admired, a model to be followed. As a matter of fact, nothing could be more slothful or slow, more given up to a life of ease and degeneracy, than the reef-building polypifer. To give him his scientific name, he is the hobo of the animal world, but unlike the hobo, he does not evening tramp for a living. He exists as a sluggish and gelatinous worm. He attracts to himself calcareous elements from the water to make himself a house. Mark you, the sea does the building, he dies, and he leaves his house behind him, and a reputation for industry, beside which the reputation of the ant turns pale, and that of the bee becomes of little account. On a coral reef you are treading on rock that the reef-building polypifers of ages have left behind them as evidences of their idle and apparently useless lives. You may fancy that the reef is formed of dead rock, but it is not. That is where the wonder of the thing comes in. A coral reef is half alive. If it were not, it would not resist the action of the sea 10 years. The live part of the reef is just where the breakers come in and beyond. The gelatinous rock-building polypifers die almost at once, if exposed to the sun or if left uncovered by water. Sometimes, at very low tide, if you have courage enough to risk being swept away by the breakers, Going as far out on the reef as you can, you may catch a glimpse of them in their living state, great mounds and masses of what seems rock, but which is a honeycomb of coral, whose cells are filled with the living polypifers. Those in the uppermost cells are usually dead, but lower down they are living, always dying, always being renewed, devoured by fish, attacked by the sea. That is the life of a coral reef. It is a thing as living as a cabbage or a tree. Every storm tears a piece off the reef, which the living coral replaces. Wounds occur in it which actually granulate and heal as wounds do of the human body. There is nothing, perhaps, more mysterious in nature than this fact of the existence of a living land, a land that repairs itself when injured by vital processes and resists the eternal attack of the sea by vital force, especially when we think of the extent of some of these lagoon islands or atolls whose existences are an eternal battle with the waves. Unlike the island of this story, which is an island surrounded by a barrier reef of coral surrounding a space of sea, the lagoon, the reef forms the island. The reef may be grown over by trees, or it may be perfectly destitute of important vegetation, or it may be crusted with islets. Some islets may exist within the lagoon, but as often as not it is just a great empty lake floored with sand and coral, peopled with life different to the life of the outside ocean, protected from the waves, and reflecting the sky like a mirror. When we remember that the atoll is a living thing, an organic whole, as full of life, though not so highly organized as a tortoise, the meanest imagination must be struck with the immensity of one of the structures. Legion Atoll in the Low Archipelago, measured from lagoon edge to lagoon edge, is 60 miles long by 20 miles broad at its broadest part. In the Marshall Archipelago, Rimsky-Korsakov is 54 miles long and 20 miles broad, and Rimsky-Korsakov is a living thing, secreting, excreting, and growing, more highly organized than the coconut trees that grow upon its back, or the blossoms that powder the havu trees in its groves. The story of coral is the story of a world, and the longest chapter 1. That story concerns itself with coral's infinite variety and form. Out on the margin of the reef, where Dick was spearing fish, you may have seen a peach blossom-colored lichen on the rock. This lichen was a form of coral, coral growing upon coral, and in the pools at the edge of the surf branching corals also of the color of a peach bloom. Within 100 yards of where Emmeline was sitting, the pools contained corals of all colors, from lake red to pure white, and the lagoon behind her, corals of the quaintest and strangest forms. Dick had speared several fish, and had left them lying on the reef to be picked up later on. Tired of killing, he was now wandering along, examining the various living things he came across. Huge slugs inhabited the reef, slugs as big as parsnips and somewhat of the same shape. They were a species of bechstemer, globe-shaped jellyfish as big as oranges, great cuttlefish bones flat and shining and white, shark's teeth, spines of a cheney, sometimes a dead scarus fish, its stomach distended with bits of coral on which it had been feeding, crabs, sea urchins, seaweeds of strange color and shape, starfish, some tiny and of the color of cayenne pepper, some huge and pale. These and 1,000 other things, beautiful or strange, were to be found on the reef. Dick had laid his spear down and was exploring a deep bath-like pool. He had waded up to his knees and was in the act of wading further when he was suddenly seized by the foot. It was just as if his ankle had been suddenly caught in a clove hitch and the rope drawn tight. Chapter 4. What Beauty Concealed. Emmeline, seated on the coral rock, had almost forgotten Dick for a moment. The sun was setting, and the warm amber light of the sunset shone on reef and rock pool. Just at sunset and low tide the reef had a peculiar fascination for her. It had the low tide smell of seaweed exposed to the air, and the torment and trouble of the breakers seemed eased. Before her, and on either side, the foam-dashed coral glowed in amber and gold, and the great Pacific came glassing and glittering in, voiceless and peaceful, till it reached the strand and burst into song and spray. Here, just as on the hilltop at the other side of the island, you could mark the rhythm of the rollers. Forever and forever, forever and forever, they seemed to say. The cry of the gulls came mixed with the spray on the breeze. They haunted the reef like uneasy spirits, always complaining, never at rest. But at sunset their cry seemed farther away and less melancholy, perhaps because just then the whole island world seemed bathed in the spirit of peace. She turned from the sea prospect and looked backwards over the lagoon to the island. She could make out the broad green glade beside which their little house lay, and a spot of yellow, which was the thatch of the house, just by the ardu tree, and nearly hidden by the shadow of the breadfruit. Over the woods the fronds of the great cocoanut palms showed above every other tree silhouetted against the dim, dark blue of the eastern sky. Seen by the enchanted light of sunset, the whole picture had an unreal look, more lovely than a dream. At dawn, and Dick would often start for the reef before dawn, if the tide served, the picture was as beautiful, more so, perhaps, for over the island, all in shadow, and against the stars, you would see the pom-poms catching fire, and then the light of day coming through the green trees and blue sky, like a spirit, across the blue lagoon, widening and strengthening as it widened across the white foam, out over the sea, spreading like a fan, till, all at once, night was day, and the gulls were crying, and the breakers flashing, the dawn wind blowing, and the palm trees bending, as palm trees only know how. Emmeline always imagined herself alone on the island with Dick, but Beauty was there, too, and Beauty is a great companion. The girl was contemplating the scene before her. Nature in her friendliest mood seemed to say, "Behold me. Men call me cruel, men have called me deceitful, evening treacherous. Well, my answer is, behold me." The girl was contemplating the specious beauty of it all, when on the breeze from seaward came a shout. She turned quickly. There was Dick up to his knees in a rock pool 100 yards or so away, motionless, his arms upraised, and crying out for help. She sprang to her feet. There had once been an islet on this part of the reef, a tiny thing, consisting of a few palms and a handful of vegetation, and destroyed, perhaps, in some great storm. I mention this because the existence of this islet once upon a time was the means, indirectly, of saving Dick's life, for where these islets have been or are, flats, occur on the reef formed of coral conglomerate. Emmeline and her bare feet could never have reached him in time over rough coral, but, fortunately, this flat and comparatively smooth surface lay between them. "My spear!" shouted Dick as she approached. He seemed at first tangled in brambles, then she thought ropes were tangling round him and tying him to something in the water. Whatever it was most awful and hideous, and like a nightmare. She ran with the speed of Atalanta to the rock where the spear was resting, all red with the blood of new-slain fish, a foot from the point. As she approached Dick, spear in hand, she saw, gasping with terror, that the ropes were alive, and that they were flickering and rippling over his back. One of them bound his left arm to his side, but his right arm was free. "Quick!" he shouted. In a second the spear was in his free hand, and Emmeline had cast herself down on her knees, and was staring with terrified eyes into the water of the pool from where the ropes issued. She was, despite her terror, quite prepared to fling herself in and do battle with the thing, whatever it may be. What she saw was only for a second. In the deep water of the pool, gazing up and forward and straight at Dick, she saw a face, lugubrious and awful. The eyes were wide as saucers, stony and steadfast. A large, heavy, parrot-like beak hung before the eyes and worked and wobbled and seemed to beckon. But what froze one's heart was the expression of the eyes, so stony and lugubrious, so passionless, so devoid of speculation, yet so fixed of purpose and full of fate. From away far down he had risen with a rising tide. He had been feeding on crabs, when the tide, betraying him, had gone out, leaving him trapped in the rock pool. He had slept, perhaps, and awakened to find a being, naked and defenseless, invading his pool. He was quite small, as octopods go, and young, yet he was large and powerful enough to have drowned an ox. The octopod has only been described once in stone by a Japanese artist. The statue is still extant, and it is the most terrible masterpiece of sculpture ever executed by human hands. It represents a man who has been bathing on a low-tide beach and has been caught. The man is shouting in a delirium of terror and threatening with his free arm the spectre that has him in its grip. The eyes of the octopod are fixed upon the man, passionless and lugubrious eyes, but steadfast and fixed. Another whiplash shot out of the water in a shower of spray and seized Dick by the left thigh. At the same instant he drove the point of the spear through the right eye of the monster, deep down through eye and soft gelatinous carcass till the spear point dirled and splintered against the rock. At the same moment the water of the pool became black as ink, the bands around him relaxed, and he was free. Emmeline rose up and seized him, sobbing and clinging to him, and kissing him. He clasped her with his left arm round her body, as if to protect her, but it was a mechanical action. He was not thinking of her. Wild with rage, and uttering hoarse cries, he plunged the broken spear again and again into the depths of the pool, seeking utterly to destroy the enemy that had so lately had him in its grip. Then slowly he came to himself, and wiped his forehead, and looked at the broken spear in his hand. "Beast," he said, "did you see its eyes? Did you see its eyes? I wish it had 100 eyes, and I had 100 spears to drive into them." She was clinging to him, and sobbing and laughing hysterically, and praising him. One may have thought that he had rescued her from death, not she him. The sun had nearly vanished, and he led her back to where the dinghy was moored, recapturing and putting on his trousers on the road. He picked up the dead fish he had speared, and as he rowed her back across the lagoon, he talked and laughed, recounting the incidents of the fight, taking all the glory of the thing to himself, and seeming quite to ignore the important part she had played in it. This was not from any callousness or want of gratitude, but simply from the fact that for the last 5 years he had been the be-all and end-all of their tiny community, the imperial master, and he would just as soon have thought of thanking her for handing him the spear as of thanking his right hand for driving it home. She was quite content, seeking neither thanks nor praise. Everything she had came from him. She was his shadow and his slave. He was her son. He went over the fight again and again before they lay down to rest, telling her he had done this and that, and what he would do to the next beast of the sort. The reiteration was tiresome enough, or would have been to an outside listener, but to Emmeline it was better than Homer. People's minds do not improve in an intellectual sense when they are isolated from the world, evening though they are living the wild and happy lives of savages. Then Dick lay down in the dried ferns and covered himself with a piece of the striped flannel which they used for blanketing, and he snored and chattered in his sleep like a dog hunting imaginary game, and Emmeline lay beside him wakeful and thinking. A new terror had come into her life. Chapter 5. The Sound of a Drum. The next day Dick was sitting under the shade of the ardu. He had the box of fishhooks beside him, and he was bending the line onto one of them. There had originally been a couple of dozen hooks, large and small, in the box. There remained now only 6, 4 small and 2 large ones. It was a large one he was fixing to the line, for he intended going on the tomorrow to the old place to fetch some bananas, and on the way to try for a fish in the deeper parts of the lagoon. It was late afternoon, and the heat had gone out of the day. Emmeline, seated on the grass opposite to him, was holding the end of the line whilst he got the kinks out of it, when suddenly she raised her head. There was not a breath of wind. The hush of the far distant surf came through the blue weather, the only audible sound except, now and then, a movement and flutter from the bird perched in the branches of the ardu. All at once another sound mixed itself with the voice of the surf, a faint, throbbing sound, like the beating of a distant drum. "Listen," said Emmeline. Dick paused for a moment in his work. All the sounds of the island were familiar. This was something quite strange. Faint and far away, now rapid, now slow, coming from where, who could say? Sometimes it seemed to come from the sea, sometimes, if the fancy of the listener turned that way, from the woods. As they listened, a sigh came from overhead. The evening breeze had risen and was moving in the leaves of the ardu tree. Just as you may wipe a picture off a slate, the breeze banished the sound. Dick went on with his work. Next morning early he embarked in the dinghy. He took the hook and line with him, and some raw fish for bait. Emmeline helped him to push off, and stood on the bank waving her hand as he rounded the little cape covered with wild cocoanut. These expeditions of Dick's were one of her sorrows. To be left alone was frightful, yet she never complained. She was living in a paradise, but something told her that behind all that sun, all that splendor of blue sea and sky, behind the flowers and the leaves, behind all that specious and simpering appearance of happiness in nature, lurked a frown and the dragon of mischance. Dick rowed for about a mile, then he shipped his sculls and let the dinghy float. The water here was very deep, so deep that, despite its clearness, the bottom was invisible. The sunlight over the reef struck through it diagonally, filling it with sparkles. The fisherman baited his hook with a piece from the belly of a scarus and lowered it down out of sight. Then he belayed the line to a toll pin and, sitting in the bottom of the boat, hung his head over the side and gazed deep down into the water. Sometimes there was nothing to see but just the deep blue of the water. Then a flight of spangled arrowheads would cross the line of sight and vanish, pursued by a form like a moving bar of gold. Then a great fish would materialize itself and hang in the shadow of the boat motionless as a stone, save for the movement of its gills. Next moment, with a twist of the tail, it would be gone. Suddenly the dinghy shored over, and may have capsized, only for the fact that Dick was sitting on the opposite side to the side from which the line hung. Then the boat righted, the line slackened, and the surface of the lagoon, a few fathoms away, boiled as if being stirred from below by a great silver stick. He had hooked an albacore. He tied the end of the fishing line to a scull, undid the line from the toll pin, and flung the scull overboard. He did all this with wonderful rapidity, while the line was still slack. Next moment the scull was rushing over the surface of the lagoon, now towards the reef, now towards the shore, now flat, now end up. Now it would be jerked under the surface entirely, vanish for a moment, and then reappear. It was a most astonishing thing to watch, for the skull seemed alive, viciously alive, and imbued with some destructive purpose, as in fact it was. The most venomous of living things and the most intelligent could not have fought the great fish better. The albacore would make a frantic dash down the lagoon, hoping, perhaps, to find in the open sea a release from his foe. Then, half drowned with the pull of the scull, he would pause, dart from side to side in perplexity, and then make an equally frantic dash up the lagoon, to be checked in the same manner. Seeking the deepest depths, he would sink the scull a few fathoms, and once he sought the air, leaping into the sunlight like a crescent of silver, whilst the splash of him as he fell echoed amidst the trees bordering the lagoon. An hour passed before the great fish showed signs of weakening. The struggle had taken place up to this close to the shore, but now the skull swam out into the broad sheet of sunlit water, and slowly began to describe large circles rippling up the peaceful blue into flashing wavelets. It was a melancholy sight to watch, for the great fish had made a good fight, and one could see him, through the eye of imagination, beaten, half-drowned, dazed, and moving as is the fashion of dazed things in a circle. Dick, working the remaining oar at the stern of the boat, rowed out and seized the floating skull, bringing it on board. Foot by foot he hauled his catch towards the boat till the long gleaming line of the thing came dimly into view. The fight had been heard for miles through the lagoon water by all sorts of swimming things. The lord of the place had got sound of it. A dark fin rippled the water, and as Dick, pulling on his line, hauled his catch closer, a monstrous grey shadow stained the depths, and the glittering streak that was the albacore vanished as if engulfed in a cloud. The line came in slack, and Dick hauled in the albacore's head. It had been divided from the body as if with a huge pair of shears. The grey shadow slipped by the boat, and Dick, mad with rage, shouted and shook his fist at it. Then, seizing the albacore's head, from which he had taken the hook, he hurled it at the monster in the water. The great shark, with a movement of the tail that caused the water to swirl and the dinghy to rock, turned upon his back and engulfed the head. Then he slowly sank and vanished, just as if he had been dissolved. Chapter 6. Sails upon the Sea. Dick put the hook away and took to the sculls. He had a 3-mile row before him, and the tide was coming in, which did not make it any the easier. As he rowed, he talked and grumbled to himself. He had been in a grumbling mood for some time past. The chief cause, Emmeline. In the last few months she had changed. Evening her face had changed. A new person had come upon the island, it seemed to him, and taken the place of the Emmeline he had known from earliest childhood. This one looked different. He did not know that she had grown beautiful, he just knew that she looked different. Also, she had developed new ways that displeased him. She would go off and bathe by herself, for instance. Up to 6 months or so ago, he had been quite contented, sleeping and eating, and hunting for food and cooking it, building and rebuilding the house, exploring the woods and the reef. But lately a spirit of restlessness had come upon him. He did not know exactly what he wanted. He had a vague feeling that he wanted to go away from the place where he was, not from the island, but from the place where they had pitched their tent, or rather built their house. It may have been the spirit of civilization crying out in him, telling him of all he was missing, of the cities and the streets and the houses and the businesses and the striving after gold, the striving after power. It may have been simply the man in him crying out for love, and not knowing yet that love was at his elbow. The dinghy glided along, hugging the shore, past the little glades of fern and the cathedral gloom of the breadfruit. Then, rounding a promontory, she opened the view of the break in the reef. A little bit of the white strand was visible, but he was not looking that way. He was looking towards the reef at a tiny, dark spot, not noticeable unless searched for by the eye. Always when he came on these expeditions, just here, he would hang on his oars and gaze over there, where the gulls were flying and the breakers thundering. A few years ago the spot filled him with dread as well as curiosity, but from familiarity and the dullness that time casts on everything, the dread had almost vanished, but the curiosity remained. The curiosity that makes a child look on at the slaughter of an animal even though his soul revolts at it. He gazed for a while, then he went on pulling, and the dinghy approached the beach. Something had happened on the beach. The sand was all trampled and stained red here and there. In the center lay the remains of a great fire still smoldering, and just where the water lapped the sand lay 2 deep grooves as if 2 heavy boats had been beached there. A South Sea man would have told from the shape of the grooves and the little marks of the outriggers that 2 heavy canoes had been beached there. And they had, the day before, early in the afternoon, 2 canoes, possibly from that faraway island which cast a stain on the horizon to the southwest, had entered the lagoon, one in pursuit of the other. What happened then had better be left veiled. A war drum with a sharkskin head had set the woods throbbing. The victory was celebrated all night, and at dawn the victors manned the 2 canoes and set sail for the home, or the hell, they had come from. Had you examined the strand you would have found that a line had been drawn across the beach, beyond which there were no footmarks. That meant that the rest of the island was for some reason taboo. Dick pulled the nose of the boat up a bit on the strand, then he looked around him. He picked up a broken spear that had been cast away or forgotten. It was made of some hard wood and barbed with iron. On the right-hand side of the beach something lay between the coconut trees. He approached. It was a mass of offal. The entrails of a dozen sheep seemed cast here in one mound, yet there were no sheep on the island, and sheep are not carried as a rule in war canoes. The sand on the beach was eloquent, the foot pursuing and the foot pursued, the knee of the fallen one, and then the forehead and outspread hands, the heel of the chief who has slain his enemy, beaten the body flat, burst a hole through it through which he has put his head, and who stands absolutely wearing his enemy as a cloak. The head of the man dragged on his back to be butchered like a sheep. Of these things spoke the sand, as far as the sand traces could speak. The story of the battle was still being told. The screams and the shouting, the clashing of clubs and spears were gone, yet the ghost of the fight remained. If the sand could bear such traces and tell such tales, who shall say that the plastic there was destitute of the story of the fight and the butchery? However that may have been, Dick, looking around him, had the shivering sense of having just escaped from danger. Whoever had been, had gone, he could tell that by the canoe traces, gone either out to sea or up the right stretch of the lagoon. It was important to determine this. He climbed to the hilltop and swept the sea with his eyes. There, away to the southwest, far away on the sea, he could distinguish the brown sails of two canoes. There was something indescribably mournful and lonely in their appearance. They looked like withered leaves, brown moths blown to sea, derelicts of autumn. Then, remembering the beach, these things became freighted with the most sinister thoughts for the mind of the gazer. They were hurrying away, having done their work. That they looked lonely and old and mournful, and like withered leaves blown across the sea, only heightened the horror. Dick had never seen canoes before, but he knew that these things were boats of some sort holding people, and that the people had left all those traces on the beach. How much of the horror of the thing was revealed to his subconscious intelligence, who can say? He had climbed the boulder, and he now sat down with his knees drawn up, and his hands clasped round them. Whenever he came round to this side of the island, something happened of a fateful or sinister nature. The last time he had nearly lost the dinghy, he had beached the little boat in such a way that she floated off, and the tide was just in the act of stealing her, and sweeping her from the lagoon out to sea, when he returned laden with his bananas, and rushing into the water up to his waist, saved her. Another time he had fallen out of a tree, and just by a miracle escaped death. Another time a hurricane had broken, lashing the lagoon into snow, and sending the coconuts bounding and flying like tennis balls across the strand. This time he had just escaped something, he knew not exactly what. It was almost as if Providence were saying to him, "Don't come here." He watched the brown sails as they dwindled in the wind-blown blue. Then he came down from the hilltop and cut his bananas. He cut 4 large bunches, which caused him to make 2 journeys to the boat. When the bananas were stowed, he pushed off. For a long time a great curiosity had been pulling at his heartstrings, a curiosity of which he was dimly ashamed. Fear had given it birth, and fear still clung to it. It was, perhaps, the element of fear and the awful delight of daring the unknown that made him give way to it. He had rowed, perhaps, 100 yards when he turned the boat's head and made for the reef. It was more than 5 years since that day when he rowed across the lagoon, Emmeline sitting in the stern, with her wreath of flowers in her hand. It may have been only yesterday, for everything seemed just the same. The thunderous surf and the flying gulls, the blinding sunlight, and the salt, fresh smell of the sea. The palm tree at the entrance of the lagoon still bent gazing into the water, and round the projection of coral too, which he had last moored the boat, still lay a fragment of the rope which he had cut in his hurry to escape. Ships had come into the lagoon, perhaps, during the 5 years, but no one had noticed anything on the reef, for it was only from the hilltop that a full view of what was there could be seen, and then only by eyes knowing where to look. From the beach there was visible just a speck. It may have been, perhaps, a bit of old wreckage flung there by a wave in some big storm, a piece of old wreckage that had been tossed here and there for years and had at last found a place of rest. Dick tied the boat up and stepped onto the reef. It was high tide just as before. The breeze was blowing strongly, and overhead a man-of-war's bird, black as ebony, with a blood-red bill, came sailing, the wind doming out his wings. He circled in the air and cried out fiercely, as if resenting the presence of the intruder. Then he passed away, let himself be blown away, as it were, across the lagoon, wheeled, circled, and passed out to sea. Dick approached the place he knew, and there lay the little old barrel all warped by the powerful sun. The staves stood apart, and the hooping was rusted and broken, and whatever it had contained in the way of spirit and conviviality had long ago drained away. Beside the barrel lay a skeleton, round which lay a few rags of cloth. The skull had fallen to one side, and the lower jaw had fallen from the skull. The bones of the hands and feet were still articulated, and the ribs had not fallen in. It was all white and bleached, and the sun shone on it as indifferently as on the coral, this shell and framework that had once been a man. There was nothing dreadful about it, but a whole world of wonder. To Dick, who had not been broken into the idea of death, who had not learned to associate it with graves and funerals, sorrow, eternity, and hell, the thing spoke as it never could have spoken to you or me. Looking at it, things linked themselves together in his mind. The skeletons of birds he had found in the woods, the fish he had slain, evening trees lying dead and rotten, evening the shells of crabs. If you had asked him what lay before him, and if he could have expressed the thought in his mind, he would have answered you, change. All the philosophy in the world could not have told him more than he knew just then about death. He, who evening did not know its name, he was held spellbound by the marvel and miracle of the thing and the thoughts that suddenly crowded his mind like a host of specters for whom a door has just been opened. Just as a child by unanswerable logic knows that a fire which has burned him once will burn him again, or will burn another person, he knew that just as the form before him was his form would be some day, and Emmeline's. Then came the vague question which is born not of the brain, but the heart, and which is the basis of all religions, where shall I be then? His mind was not of an introspective nature, and the question just strayed across it and was gone. And still the wonder of the thing held him. He was for the first time in his life in a reverie. The corpse that had shocked and terrified him 5 years ago had cast seeds of thought with its dead fingers upon his mind. The skeleton had brought them to maturity. The full fact of universal death suddenly appeared before him, and he recognized it. He stood for a long time motionless, and then with a deep sigh turned to the boat and pushed off without once looking back at the reef. He crossed the lagoon and rowed slowly homewards, keeping in the shelter of the tree shadows as much as possible. Evening looking at him from the shore, you may have noticed a difference in him. Your savage paddles his canoe or sculls his boat, alert, glancing about him, at touch with nature at all points. Though he be lazy as a cat and sleeps half the day, awake he is all ears and eyes, a creature reacting to the least external impression. Dick, as he rowed back, did not look about him. He was thinking or retrospecting. The savage in him had received a check. As he turned the little cape, where the wild coconut blazed, he looked over his shoulder. A figure was standing on the sward by the edge of the water. Chapter 7. The Schooner. They carried the bananas up to the house and hung them from a branch of the ardu. Then Dick, on his knees, lit the fire to prepare the evening meal. When it was over he went down to where the boat was moored, and returned with something in his hand. It was the javelin with the iron point, or rather, the 2 pieces of it. He had said nothing of what he had seen to the girl. Emmeline was seated on the grass. She had a long strip of the striped flannel stuff about her, worn like a scarf, and she had another piece in her hand which she was hemming. The bird was hopping about, pecking at a banana which they had thrown to him. A light breeze made the shadow of the ardu leaves dance upon the grass, and the serrated leaves of the breadfruit to patter one on the other with the sound of raindrops falling upon glass. "Where did you get it?" asked Emmeline, staring at the piece of the javelin, which Dick had flung down almost beside her whilst he went into the house to fetch the knife. "It was on the beach over there," he replied, taking his seat and examining the 2 fragments to see how he could splice them together. Emmeline looked at the pieces, putting them together in her mind. She did not like the look of the thing, so keen and savage and stained dark of foot and more from the point. "People had been there," said Dick, putting the 2 pieces together and examining the fracture critically. "Where?" "Over there." This was lying on the sand, and the sand was all trod up. "Dick," said Emmeline, "who were the people?" "I don't know. I went up the hill and saw their boats going away, far away out." This was lying on the sand. "Dick," said Emmeline, "do you remember the noise yesterday?" "Yes," said Dick, "I heard it in the night." "In the night before the moon went away." "That was them," said Dick. "Dick." "Yes." "Who were they?" "I don't know," replied Dick. "It was in the night before the moon went away, and it went on and on beating in the trees. I thought I was asleep, and then I knew I was awake. You were asleep, and I pushed you to listen, but you couldn't wake. You were so asleep. Then the moon went away, and the noise went on. How did they make the noise? I don't know, replied Dick, but it was them, and they left this on the sand, and the sand was all trod up, and I saw their boats from the hill, away out far. I thought I heard voices, said Emmeline, but I was not sure. She fell into meditation, watching her companion at work on the savage and sinister-looking thing in his hands. He was splicing the two pieces together with a strip of the brown cloth-like stuff, which is wrapped round the stalks of the coca palm fronds. The thing seemed to have been hurled here out of the blue by some unseen hand. When he had spliced the pieces, doing so with marvelous dexterity, he took the thing short down near the point and began thrusting it into the soft earth to clean it. Then, with a bit of flannel, he polished it till it shone. He felt a keen delight in it. It was useless as a fish spear, because it had no barb, but it was a weapon. It was useless as a weapon, because there was no foe on the island to use it against. Still, it was a weapon. When he had finished scrubbing at it, he rose, hitched his old trousers up, tightened the belt of coca cloth which Emmeline had made for him, went into the house and got his fish spear, and stalked off to the boat, calling out to Emmeline to follow him. They crossed over to the reef, where, as usual, he divested himself of clothing. It was strange that out here he would go about stark naked, yet on the island he always wore some covering. But not so strange, perhaps, after all. The sea is a great purifier, both of the mind and the body, before that great sweet spirit people do not think in the same way as they think far inland. What woman would appear in a town or on a country road, or evening bathing in a river, as she appears bathing in the sea? Some instinct made Dick cover himself up on shore, and strip naked on the reef. In a minute he was down by the edge of the surf, javelin in one hand, fish spear in the other. Emmeline, by a little pool the bottom of which was covered with branching coral, sat gazing down into its depths, lost in a reverie like that into which we fall when gazing at shapes in the fire. She had sat some time like this, when a shout from Dick aroused her. She started to her feet and gazed to where he was pointing. An amazing thing was there, to the east, just rounding the curve of the reef, and scarcely a quarter of a mile from it, was coming a big topsail schooner. A beautiful sight she was, heeling to the breeze with every sail drawing, and the white foam like a feather at her forefoot. Dick, with the javelin in his hand, was standing gazing at her. He had dropped his fish spear, and he stood as motionless as though he were carved out of stone. Emmeline ran to him and stood beside him. Neither of them spoke a word as the vessel drew closer. Everything was visible, so close was she now, from the reef points on the great mainsail, luminous with the sunlight, and white as the wing of a gull, to the rail of the bulwarks. A crowd of men were hanging over the port bulwarks gazing at the island and the figures on the reef. Browned by the sun and sea breeze, Emmeline's hair blowing on the wind and the point of Dick's javelin flashing in the sun, they looked an ideal pair of savages, seen from the schooner's deck. "They are going away," said Emmeline, with a long-drawn breath of relief. Dick made no reply. He stared at the schooner a moment longer in silence. Then, having made sure that she was standing away from the land, he began to run up and down, calling out wildly, and beckoning to the vessel as if to call her back. A moment later a sound came on the breeze, a faint hail. A flag was run up to the peak and dipped as in derision, and the vessel continued on her course. As a matter of fact, she had been on the point of putting about. Her captain had for a moment been undecided as to whether the forms on the reef were those of castaways or savages. Chapter 8. Love Steps In. Two birds were sitting in the branches of the ardu tree. Coco had taken a mate. They had built a nest out of fibers pulled from the wrappings of the coconut fronds, bits of stick and wire grass, anything, in fact, evening fibers from the palmetto thatch of the house below. The pilferings of birds, the building of nests, what charming incidents they are in the great episode of spring. The hawthorn tree never bloomed here. The climate was that of eternal summer. Yet the spirit of May came just as she comes to the English countryside or the German forest. The doings in the Ardu branches greatly interested Emmeline. The love-making and the nest-building were conducted quite in the usual manner, according to rules laid down by nature and carried out by men and birds. All sorts of quaint sounds came filtering down through the leaves from the branch where the sapphire-colored lovers sat side by side, or the fork where the nest was beginning to form. Croonings and cluckings. Sounds like the flirting of a fan, the sounds of a squabble, followed by the sounds that told of the squabble made up. Sometimes after one of these squabbles a pale blue downy feather or two would come floating earthwards, touch the palmetto leaves of the house roof and cling there, or be blown onto the grass. It was some days after the appearance of the schooner, and Dick was making ready to go into the woods and pick guavas. He had all the morning been engaged in making a basket to carry them in. In civilization he would, judging from his mechanical talent, perhaps have been an engineer, building bridges and ships, instead of palmetto leaf baskets and cane houses. Who knows if he would have been happier? The heat of midday had passed, when, with the basket hanging over his shoulder on a piece of cane, he started for the woods, Emmeline following. The place they were going to always filled her with a vague dread. Not for a great deal would she have gone there alone. Dick had discovered it in one of his rambles. They entered the wood and passed a little well, a well without apparent source or outlet and a bottom of fine white sand. How the sand had formed there, it would be impossible to say. But there it was, and around the margin grew ferns redoubling themselves on the surface of the crystal-clear water. They left this to the right and struck into the heart of the wood. The heat of midday still lurked here. The way was clear, for there was a sort of path between the trees, as if, in very ancient days, there had been a road. Right across this path, half lost in shadow, half sunlit, the lianas hung their ropes. The hatu tree, with its powdering of delicate blossoms, here stood, showing its lost loveliness to the sun. In the shade the scarlet hibiscus burned like a flame. Ardu and breadfruit trees and cocoanut bordered the way. As they proceeded, the trees grew denser and the path more obscure. All at once, rounding a sharp turn, the path ended in a valley carpeted with fern. This was the place that always filled Emmeline with an undefined dread. One side of it was all built up in terraces with huge blocks of stone so enormous that the wonder was how the ancient builders had put them in their places. Trees grew along the terraces, thrusting their roots between the interstices of the blocks. At their base, slightly tilted forward as if with the sinkage of years, stood a great stone figure roughly carved, 30 feet high at least, mysterious-looking, the very spirit of the place. This figure and the terraces, the valley itself, and the very trees that grew there, inspired Emmeline with deep curiosity and vague fear. People had been here once. Sometimes she could fancy she saw dark shadows moving amidst the trees, and the whisper of the foliage seemed to her to hide voices at times, evening as its shadow concealed forms. It was truly an uncanny place to be alone in evening under the broad light of day. All across the Pacific for thousands of miles you find relics of the past, like these scattered through the islands. These temple places are nearly all the same, great terraces of stone, massive idols, desolation overgrown with foliage. They hint at one religion and a time when the sea space of the Pacific was a continent, which, sinking slowly through the ages, has left only its higher lands and hilltops visible in the form of islands. Round these places the woods are thicker than elsewhere, hinting at the presence there, once, of sacred groves. The idols are immense, their faces are vague. The storms and the suns and the rains of the ages have cast over them a veil. The Sphinx is understandable and a toy compared to these things, some of which have a stature of 50 feet, whose creation is veiled in absolute mystery, the gods of a people forever and forever lost. The Stone Man was the name Emmeline had given the idol of the valley, and sometimes at nights, when her thoughts would stray that way, she would picture him standing all alone in the moonlight or starlight staring straight before him. He seemed forever listening. Unconsciously one fell to listening too, and then the valley seemed steeped in a supernatural silence. He was not good to be alone with. Emmeline sat down amidst the fears just at his base. When one was close up to him, he lost the suggestion of life, and was simply a great stone, which cast a shadow in the sun. Dick threw himself down also to rest. Then he rose up and went off amidst the guava bushes, plucking the fruit and filling his basket. Since he had seen the schooner, the white men on her decks, her great masts and sails, and general appearance of freedom and speed and unknown adventure, he had been more than ordinarily glum and restless. Perhaps he connected her in his mind with the faraway vision of the Northumberland, and the idea of other places and lands, and the yearning for change the idea of them inspired. He came back with his basket full of the ripe fruit, gave some to the girl, and sat down beside her. When she had finished eating them, she took the cane that he used for carrying the basket and held it in her hands. She was bending it in the form of a bow, when it slipped, flew out, and struck her companion a sharp blow on the side of his face. Almost on the instant he turned and slapped her on the shoulder. She stared at him for a moment in troubled amazement. A sob came in her throat. Then some veil seemed lifted, some wizard's wand stretched out, some mysterious vial broken. As she looked at him like that, he suddenly and fiercely clasped her in his arms. He held her like this for a moment, dazed, stupefied, not knowing what to do with her. Chapter 9. The Sleep of Paradise. The moon rose up that evening and shot her silver arrows at the house under the ardu tree. The house was empty. Then the moon came across the sea and across the reef. She lit the lagoon to its dark, dim heart. She lit the coral brains and sand spaces and the fish, casting their shadows on the sand and the coral. The keeper of the lagoon rose to greet her, and the fin of him broke her reflection on the mirror-like surface into 1,000 glittering ripples. She saw the white staring ribs of the form on the reef. Then, peeping over the trees, she looked down into the valley, where the great idol of stone had kept its solitary vigil for 5,000 years, perhaps, or more. At his base, in his shadow, looking as if under his protection, lay 2 human beings, naked, clasped in each other's arms, and fast asleep. One could scarcely pity his vigil had it been marked sometimes through the years by such an incident as this. The thing had been conducted just as the birds conduct their love affairs, an affair absolutely natural, absolutely blameless, and without sin. It was a marriage according to nature, without feast or guests, consummated with accidental cynicism under the shadow of a religion 1,000 years dead. So happy in their ignorance were they, that they only knew that suddenly life had changed, that the skies and the sea were bluer, and that they had become in some magical way one a part of the other. Chapter 10. An Island Honeymoon. One day Dick climbed onto the tree above the house, and, driving Madame Coco off the nest upon which she was sitting, peeped in. There were several pale green eggs in it. He did not disturb them, but climbed down again, and the bird resumed her seat as if nothing had happened. Such an occurrence would have terrified a bird used to the ways of men, but here the birds were so fearless and so full of confidence that often they would follow Emmeline in the wood, flying from branch to branch, peering at her through the leaves, lighting quite close to her, once, evening, on her shoulder. The days passed. Dick had lost his restlessness, his wish to wander had vanished. He had no reason to wander, perhaps that was the reason why. In all the broad earth he could not have found anything more desirable than what he had. Instead now of finding a half-naked savage followed dog-like by his mate, you would have found of an evening a pair of lovers wandering on the reef. They had in a pathetic sort of way attempted to adorn the house with a blue flowering creeper taken from the wood, and trained over the entrance. Emmeline, up to this, had mostly done the cooking, such as it was. Dick helped her now, always. He talked to her no longer in short sentences flung out as if to a dog, and she, almost losing the strange reserve that had clung to her from childhood, half showed him her mind. It was a curious mind, the mind of a dreamer, almost the mind of a poet. The Cluricons dwelt there, and vague shapes born of things she had heard about or dreamt of. She had thoughts about the sea and stars, the flowers and birds. Dick would listen to her as she talked, as a man may listen to the sound of a rivulet. His practical mind could take no share in the dreams of his other half, but her conversation pleased him. He would look at her for a long time together, absorbed in thought. He was admiring her. Her hair, blue-black and glossy, tangled him in its meshes. He would stroke it, so to speak, with his eyes, and then pull her close to him and bury his face in it. The smell of it was intoxicating. He breathed her as one does the perfume of a rose. Her ears were small and like little white shells. He would take one between finger and thumb and play with it as if it were a toy, pulling at the lobe of it, or trying to flatten out the curved part. Her breasts, her shoulders, her knees, her little feet, every bit of her, he would examine and play with and kiss. She would lie and let him, seeming absorbed in some faraway thought, of which he was the object. Then all at once her arms would go round him. All this used to go on in the broad light of day, under the shadow of the ardu leaves, with no one to watch except the bright-eyed birds in the leaves above. Not all their time would be spent in this fashion. Dick was just as keen after the fish. He dug up with a spade, improvised from one of the boards of the dinghy, a space of soft earth near the taro patch, and planted the seeds of melons he found in the wood. He rethatched the house. They were, in short, as busy as they could be in such a climate, but love-making would come on them in fits, and then everything would be forgotten. Just as one revisits some spot to renew the memory of a painful or pleasant experience received there, they would return to the Valley of the Idol and spend a whole afternoon in its shade. The absolute happiness of wandering through the woods together, discovering new flowers, getting lost, and finding their way again, was a thing beyond expression. Dick had suddenly stumbled upon love. His courtship had lasted only some 20 minutes. It was being gone over again now, and extended. One day, hearing a curious noise from the tree above the house, he climbed it. The noise came from the nest, which had been temporarily left by the mother bird. It was a gasping, wheezing sound, and it came from 4 wide-open beaks, so anxious to be fed that one could almost see into the very crops of the owners. They were Coco's children. In another year each of those ugly downy things would, if permitted to live, be a beautiful sapphire-colored bird with a few dove-colored tail feathers, coral beak, and bright, intelligent eyes. A few days ago each of these things was imprisoned in a pale green egg. A month ago they were nowhere. Something hit Dick on the cheek. It was the mother bird returned with food for the young ones. Chapter 11. The Vanishing of Emmeline. Months passed away. Only one bird remained in the branches of the ardu. Coco's children and mate had vanished, but he remained. The breadfruit leaves had turned from green to pale gold and darkest amber, and now the new green leaves were being presented to the spring. Dick, who had a complete chart of the lagoon in his head and knew all the soundings and best fishing places, the locality of the stinging coral, and the places where you could wade right across at low tide, Dick, one morning, was gathering his things together for a fishing expedition. The place he was going to lay some 2.5 miles away across the island, and as the road was bad he was going alone. Emmeline had been passing a new thread through the beads of the necklace she sometimes wore. This necklace had a history. In the shallows not far away, Dick had found a bed of shellfish. Wading out at low tide, he had taken some of them out to examine. They were oysters. The first one he opened, so disgusting did its appearance seem to him, may have been the last, only that under the beard of the thing lay a pearl. It was about twice the size of a large pea, and so lustrous that evening he could not but admire its beauty, though quite unconscious of its value. He flung the unopened oysters down, and took the thing to Emmeline. Next day, returning by chance to the same spot, he found the oysters he had cast down all dead and open in the sun. He'd examined them, and found another pearl embedded in one of them. Then he collected nearly a bushel of the oysters, and left them to die and open. The idea had occurred to him of making a necklace for his companion. She had one made of shells. He'd intended to make her one of pearls. It took a long time, but it was something to do. He pierced them with a big needle, and at the end of 4 months or so the thing was complete. Great pearls, most of them were pure white, black, pink, some perfectly round, some tear-shaped, some irregular. The thing was worth 15 or perhaps 20,000 pounds, for he only used the biggest he could find, casting away the small ones as useless. Emmeline this morning had just finished restringing them on a double thread. She looked pale and not at all well, and had been restless all night. As he went off, armed with his spear and fishing tackle, she waved her hand to him without getting up. Usually she followed him a bit into the wood when he was going away like this, but this morning she just sat at the doorway of the little house, the necklace in her lap, following him with her eyes until he was lost amidst the trees. He had no compass to guide him, and he needed none. He knew the woods by heart, the mysterious line beyond, which scarcely an ardu tree was to be found. The long strip of Miami apple, a regular sheet of it 100 yards broad and reaching from the middle of the island right down to the lagoon. The clearings, some almost circular where the ferns grew knee-deep. Then he came to the bad part. The vegetation here had burst into a riot. All sorts of great sappy stalks of unknown plants barred the way and tangled the foot, and there were boggy places into which one sank horribly, pausing to wipe one's brow. The stalks and tendrils one had beaten down or beaten aside rose up and closed together, making one a prisoner almost as closely surrounded as a fly in amber. All the noontides that had ever fallen upon the island seemed to have left some of their heat behind them here. The air was damp and close like the air of a laundry, and the mournful and perpetual buzz of insects filled the silence without destroying it. 100 men with scythes may make a road through the place today. A month or two later, searching for the road, you would find none. The vegetation would have closed in as water closes when divided. This was the haunt of the jug orchid, a veritable jug, lid and all. Raising the lid you would find the jug half filled with water. Sometimes in the tangle up above, between two trees, you would see a thing like a bird come to ruin. Orchids grew here as in a hothouse. All the trees, the few there were, had a spectral and miserable appearance. They were half starved by the voluptuous growth of the gigantic weeds. If one had much imagination, one felt afraid in this place, for one felt not alone. At any moment it seemed that one may be touched on the elbow by a hand reaching out from the surrounding tangle. Evening Dick felt this, unimaginative and fearless as he was. It took him nearly 3/4 of an hour to get through, and then, at last, came the blessed air of real day, and a glimpse of the lagoon between the tree boles. He would have rowed round in the dinghy, only that at low tide the shallows of the north of the island were a bar to the boat's passage. Of course he may have rowed all the way round by way of the Strand and Reef entrance, but that would have meant a circuit of 6 miles or more. When he came between the trees down to the lagoon edge it was about 11 o'clock in the morning, and the tide was nearly at the full. The lagoon just here was like a trough, and the reef was very near, scarcely 1/4 of a mile from the shore. The water did not shelve, it went down sheer 50 fathoms or more, and one could fish from the bank just as from a pier head. He had brought some food with him, and he placed it under a tree whilst he prepared his line, which had a lump of coral for a sinker. He baited the hook, and whirling the sinker round in the air sent it flying out 100 feet from shore. There was a baby coconut tree growing just at the edge of the water. He fastened the end of his line round the narrow stem, in case of eventualities, and then, holding the line itself, he fished. He had promised Emmeline to return before sundown. He was a fisherman, that is to say, a creature with the enduring patience of a cat, tireless and heedless of time as an oyster. He came here for sport more than for fish. Large things were to be found in this part of the lagoon. The last time he had hooked a horror in the form of a catfish. At least in outward appearance it was likest to a Mississippi catfish. Unlike the catfish, it was coarse and useless as food, but it gave good sport. The tide was now going out, and it was at the going out of the tide that the best fishing was to be had. There was no wind, and the lagoon lay like a sheet of glass, with just a dimple here and there where the outgoing tide made a swirl in the water. As he fished, he thought of Emmeline and the little house under the trees. Scarcely one could call it thinking. Pictures passed before his mind's eye, pleasant and happy pictures, sunlit, moonlit, starlit. 3 hours passed thus without a bite or symptom that the lagoon contained anything else but sea water and disappointment. But he did not grumble. He was a fisherman. Then he left the line tied to the tree and sat down to eat the food he had brought with him. He had scarcely finished his meal when the baby coconut tree shivered and became convulsed, and he did not require to touch the taut line to know that it was useless to attempt to cope with the thing at the end of it. The only course was to let it tug and drown itself. So he sat down and watched. After a few minutes the line slackened and the little coconut tree resumed its attitude of pensive meditation and repose. He pulled the line up. There was nothing at the end of it but a hook. He did not grumble. He baited the hook again and flung it in, for it was quite likely that the ferocious thing in the water would bite again. Full of this idea and heedless of time, he fished and waited. The sun was sinking into the west. He did not heed it. He had quite forgotten that he had promised Emmeline to return before sunset. It was nearly sunset now. Chapter 12. The vanishing of Emmeline continued. He dropped the line and turned with a start. There was no one visible. He ran amongst the trees calling out her name, but only echoes answered. Then he came back to the lagoon edge. He felt sure that what he had heard was only fancy, but it was nearly sunset, and more than time to be off. He pulled in his line, wrapped it up, took his fish spear and started. It was just in the middle of the bad place that dread came to him. What if anything had happened to her? It was dusk here, and never had the weeds seemed so thick, the mist so dismal, the tendrils of the vines so gin-like. Then he lost his way, he who was so sure of his way always. The hunter's instinct had been crossed, and for a time he went here and there helpless as a ship without a compass. At last he broke into the real wood, but far to the right of where he ought to have been. He felt like a beast escaped from a trap, and hurried along, led by the sound of the surf. When he reached the clear sward that led down to the lagoon, the sun had just vanished beyond the sea line. A streak of red cloud floated like the feather of a flamingo in the western sky close to the sea, and twilight had already filled the world. He could see the house dimly, under the shadow of the trees, and he ran towards it, crossing the sward diagonally. Always before, when he had been away, the first thing to greet his eyes on his return had been the figure of Emmeline. Either at the lagoon edge or the house door he would find her waiting for him. She was not waiting for him tonight. When he reached the house she was not there, and he paused, after searching the place, a prey to the most horrible perplexity, and unable for the moment to think or act. Since the shock of the occurrence on the reef she had been subject at times to occasional attacks of headache, and when the pain was more than she could bear, she would go off and hide. Dick would hunt for her amidst the trees, calling out her name, and hallooing, if faint, hallow, would answer when she heard him, and then he would find her under a tree or bush, with her unfortunate head between her hands, a picture of misery. He remembered this now, and started off along the borders of the wood, calling to her, and pausing to listen. No answer came. He searched amidst the trees as far as the little well, waking the echoes with his voice. Then he came back slowly, peering about him in the deep dusk that now was yielding to the starlight. He sat down before the door of the house, and, looking at him, you may have fancied him in the last stages of exhaustion. Profound grief and profound exhaustion act on the frame very much in the same way. He sat with his chin resting on his chest, his hands helpless. He could hear her voice, still as he heard it over at the other side of the island. She had been in danger and called to him, and he had been calmly fishing, unconscious of it all. This thought maddened him. He sat up, stared around him and beat the ground with the palms of his hands. Then he sprang to his feet and made for the dinghy. He rode to the reef, the action of a madman, for she could not possibly be there. There was no moon. The starlight both lit and veiled the world, and no sound but the majestic thunder of the waves. As he stood, the night wind blowing on his face, the white foam seething before him, and canopus burning in the great silence overhead, the fact that he stood in the center of an awful and profound indifference came to his untutored mind with a pang. He returned to the shore. The house was still deserted. A little bowl made from the shell of a coconut stood on the grass near the doorway. He had last seen it in her hands, and he took it up and held it for a moment, pressing it tightly to his breast. Then he threw himself down before the doorway and lay upon his face, with head resting upon his arms in the attitude of a person who is profoundly asleep. He must have searched through the woods again that night just as a somnambulist searches, for he found himself towards dawn in the valley before the idol. Then it was daybreak. The world was full of light and color. Chapter 13. The newcomer. He could not move for a moment. Then he sprang to his feet and ran towards her. She looked pale and dazed, and she held something in her arms, something wrapped up in her scarf. As he pressed her to him, the something in the bundle struggled against his breast and emitted a squall, just like the squall of a cat. He drew back, and Emmeline, tenderly moving her scarf a bit aside, exposed a wee face. It was brick-red and wrinkled. There were 2 bright eyes, and a tuft of dark hair over the forehead. Then the eyes closed, the face screwed itself up, and the thing sneezed twice. "Where did you get it?" he asked, absolutely lost in astonishment as she covered the face again gently with the scarf. "I found it in the woods," replied Emmeline. Dumb with amazement, he helped her along to the house, and she sat down, resting her head against the bamboos of the wall. "I felt so bad," she explained, "and then I went off to sit in the woods, and then I remembered nothing more, and when I woke up it was there." "It's a baby," said Dick. "I know," replied Emmeline. Mrs. James's baby, seen in the long ago, had risen up before their mind's eyes, a messenger from the past to explain what the new thing was. Then she told him things that completely shattered the old cabbage bed theory, supplanting it with a truth far more wonderful, far more poetical, too, to he who can appreciate the marvel and the mystery of life. "It has something funny tied onto it," she went on, as if she were referring to a parcel she had just received. "Let's look," said Dick. "No," she replied, "leave it alone." She sat rocking the thing gently, seeming oblivious to the whole world and quite absorbed in it, as, truly, was Dick. A physician would have shuddered, but perhaps fortunately enough, there was no physician on the island, only nature, and she put everything to rights in her own time and way. When Dick had sat marveling long enough, he set to and lit the fire. He had eaten nothing since the day before, and he was nearly as exhausted as the girl. He cooked some breadfruit. There was some cold fish left over from the day before. This, with some bananas, he served up on 2 broad leaves, making Emmeline eat first. Before they had finished, the creature in the bundle, as though it had smelt the food, began to scream. Emmeline drew the scarf aside. It looked hungry. Its mouth would now be pinched up and now wide open. Its eyes opened and closed. The girl touched it on the lips with her finger, and it seized upon her fingertip and sucked it. Her eyes filled with tears. She looked appealingly at Dick, who was on his knees. He took a banana, peeled it, broke off a bit and handed it to her. She approached it to the baby's mouth. It tried to suck it, failed, blew bubbles at the sun and squalled. "Wait a minute," said Dick. There were some green coconuts he had gathered the day before close by. He took one, removed the green husk, and opened one of the eyes, making an opening also in the opposite side of the shell. The unfortunate infant sucked ravenously at the nut, filled its stomach with the young coconut juice, vomited violently, and wailed. Emmeline in despair clasped it to her naked breast, wherefrom, in a moment, it was hanging like a leech. Chapter 14. Hannah. At noon, in the shallows of the reef, under the burning sun, the water would be quite warm. They would carry the baby down here, and Emmeline would wash it with a bit of flannel. After a few days it scarcely ever screamed. Evening, when she washed it, it would lie on her knees during the process, striking valiantly out with its arms and legs, staring straight up at the sky. Then, when she turned it on its face, it would lay its head down and chuckle and blow bubbles at the coral of the reef, examining, apparently, the pattern of the coral with deep and philosophic attention. Dick would sit by with his knees up to his chin, watching it all. He felt himself to be part proprietor in the thing, as truly he was. The mystery of the affair still hung over them both. A week ago they two had been alone, and suddenly from nowhere this new individual had appeared. It was so complete. It had hair on its head, tiny fingernails, and hands that would grasp you. It had a whole host of little ways of its own, and every day added to them. In a week the extreme ugliness of the newborn child had vanished. Its face, which had seemed carved in the imitation of a monkey's face from half a brick, became the face of a happy and healthy baby. It seemed to see things, and sometimes it would laugh and chuckle as though it had been told a good joke. Its black hair all came off and was supplanted by a sort of down. It had no teeth. It would lie on its back and kick and crow, and double its fists up and try to swallow them alternately, and cross its feet and play with its toes. In fact, it was exactly like any of the 1,001 babies that are born into the world at every tick of the clock. "What will we call it?" said Dick one day, as he sat watching his son and heir crawling about on the grass under the shade of the breadfruit leaves. "Hannah," said Emmeline promptly. The recollection of another baby once heard about was in her mind, and it was as good a name as any other, perhaps, in that lonely place, notwithstanding the fact that Hannah was a boy. Coco took a vast interest in the new arrival. He would hop round it and peer at it with his head on one side, and Hannah would crawl after the bird and try to grab it by the tail. In a few months so valiant and strong did he become that he would pursue his own father, crawling before him on the grass, and you may have seen the mother and father and child playing all together like three children, the bird sometimes hovering overhead like a good spirit, sometimes joining in the fun. Sometimes Emmeline would sit and brood over the child, a troubled expression on her face, and a faraway look in her eyes. The old vague fear of mischance had returned, the dread of that viewless form her imagination half pictured behind the smile on the face of nature. Her happiness was so great that she dreaded to lose it. There is nothing more wonderful than the birth of a man, and all that goes to bring it about. Here, on this island, in the very heart of the sea, amidst the sunshine and the wind-blown trees, under the great blue arch of the sky, in perfect purity of thought, they would discuss the question from beginning to end without a blush, the object of their discussion crawling before them on the grass, and attempting to grab feathers from Coco's tail. It was the loneliness of the place as well as their ignorance of life that made the old miracle appear so strange and fresh, as beautiful as the miracle of death had appeared awful. In thoughts vague and beyond expression in words, they linked this new occurrence with that old occurrence on the reef 6 years before, the vanishing and the coming of a man. Hannah, despite his unfortunate name, was certainly a most virile and engaging baby. The black hair which had appeared and vanished like some practical joke played by nature, gave place to a down at first as yellow as sun-bleached wheat, but in a few months' time tinged with auburn. One day he had been uneasy and biting at his thumbs for some time past. Emmeline, looking into his mouth, saw something white and like a grain of rice protruding from his gum. It was a tooth just born. He could eat bananas now, and breadfruit, and they often fed him on fish, a fact which again may have caused a medical man to shudder, yet he throve on it all, and waxed stouter every day. Emmeline, with a profound and natural wisdom, let him crawl about stark naked, dressed in ozone and sunlight. Taking him out on the reef, she would let him paddle in the shallow pools, holding him under the armpits whilst he splashed the diamond-bright water into spray with his feet, and laughed and shouted. They were beginning now to experience a phenomenon as wonderful as the birth of the child's body, the birth of his intelligence, the peeping out of a little personality with predilections of its own, likes and dislikes. He knew Dick from Emmeline, and when Emmeline had satisfied his material wants, he would hold out his arms to go to Dick if he were by. He looked upon Coco as a friend, but when a friend of Coco's, a bird with an inquisitive mind and 3 red feathers in his tail, dropped in one day to inspect the newcomer, he resented the intrusion and screamed. He had a passion for flowers or anything bright. He would laugh and shout when taken on the lagoon in the dinghy and make as if to jump into the water to get at the bright-colored corals below. Ah me! We laugh at young mothers and all the miraculous things they tell us about their babies. They see what we cannot see. The first unfolding of that mysterious flower, the mind. One day they were out on the lagoon. Dick had been rowing. He had ceased and was letting the boat drift for a bit. Emmeline was dancing the child on her knee when it suddenly held out its arms to the oarsman and said, "Dick." The little word, so often heard and easily repeated, was its first word on earth. A voice that had never spoken in the world before had spoken, and to hear his name thus mysteriously uttered by a being he has created is the sweetest and perhaps the saddest thing a man can ever know. Chapter 15. The Lagoon of Fire. Ever since the tragedy of 6 years ago there had been forming in the mind of Emmeline Lestrange a something, shall I call it a deep mistrust? She had never been clever. Lessons had saddened and wearied her, without making her much the wiser. Yet her mind was of that order into which profound truths come by short cuts. She was intuitive. Great knowledge may lurk in the human mind without the owner of the mind being aware. He or she acts in such or such a way, or thinks in such and such a manner from intuition. In other words, as the outcome of the profoundest reasoning. When we have learned to call storms, storms, and death, death, and birth, birth. When we have mastered the sailor's horn book, and Mr. Piddington's law of cyclones, Ellis's anatomy, and Lure's midwifery, we have already made ourselves half blind. We have become hypnotized by words and names. We think in words and names, not in ideas. The commonplace has triumphed. The true intellect is half crushed. Storms had burst over the island before this, and what Emmeline remembered of them may be expressed by an instance. The morning would be bright and happy, never so bright the sun, or so balmy the breeze, or so peaceful the blue lagoon. Then, with a horrid suddenness, as if sick with dissimulation and mad to show itself, something would blacken the sun, and with a yell stretch out a hand and ravage the island, churn the lagoon into foam, beat down the coconut trees, and slay the birds. And one bird would be left and another taken, one tree destroyed and another left standing. The fury of the thing was less fearful than the blindness of it and the indifference of it. One night, when the child was asleep, just after the last star was lit, Dick appeared at the doorway of the house. He had been down to the water's edge and had now returned. He beckoned Emmeline to follow him, and putting down the child, she did so. "Come here and look," said he. He led the way to the water, and as they approached it, Emmeline became aware that there was something strange about the lagoon. From a distance it looked pale and solid. It may have been a great stretch of grey marble veined with black. Then, as she drew nearer, she saw that the dull grey appearance was a deception of the eye. The lagoon was alight and burning. The phosphoric fire was in its very heart and being. Every coral branch was a torch, every fish a passing lantern. The incoming tide moving the waters made the whole glittering floor of the lagoon move and shiver, and the tiny waves to lap the bank, leaving behind them glowworm traces. "Look," said Dick. He knelt down and plunged his forearm into the water. The immersed part burned like a smoldering torch. Emmeline could see it as plainly as though it were lit by sunlight. Then he drew his arm out, and as far as the water had reached, it was covered by a glowing glove. They had seen the phosphorescence of the lagoon before. Truly, any night you may watch the passing fish like bars of silver, when the moon was away. But this was something quite new, and it was entrancing. Emmeline knelt down and dabbled her hands, and made herself a pair of phosphoric gloves, and cried out with pleasure, and laughed. It was all the pleasure of playing with fire without the danger of being burnt. Then Dick rubbed his face with the water till it glowed. "Wait," he cried, and running up to the house he fetched out Hannah. He came running down with him to the water's edge, gave Emmeline the child, unmoored the boat, and started out from shore. The sculls, as far as they were immersed, were like bars of glistening silver. Under them passed the fish, leaving cometic tails. Each coral clump was a lamp, lending its luster till the great lagoon was luminous as a lit-up ballroom evening. The child on Emmeline's lap crowed and cried out at the strangeness of the sight. They landed on the reef and wandered over the flat. The sea was white and bright as snow, and the foam looked like a hedge of fire. As they stood gazing on this extraordinary sight, suddenly, almost as instantaneously as the switching off of an electric light, the phosphorescence of the sea flickered and vanished. The moon was rising. Chapter 16. The Cyclone. When they awoke next morning, the day was dark. A solid roof of cloud, lead-colored and without a ripple on it, lay over the sky almost to the horizon. There was not a breath of wind, and the birds flew wildly about as if disturbed by some unseen enemy in the wood. As Dick lit the fire to prepare the breakfast, Emmeline walked up and down, holding her baby to her breast. She felt restless and uneasy. As the morning wore on, the darkness increased. A breeze rose up, and the leaves of the breadfruit trees pattered together with the sound of rain falling upon glass. A storm was coming, but there was something different in its approach to the approach of the storms they had already known. As the breeze increased, a sound filled the air, coming from far away beyond the horizon. It was like the sound of a great multitude of people, and yet so faint and vague was it, that sudden bursts of the breeze through the leaves above would drown it utterly. Then it ceased, and nothing could be heard but the rocking of the branches and the tossing of the leaves under the increasing wind, which was now blowing sharply and fiercely and with a steady rush dead from the west, fretting the lagoon, and sending clouds and masses of foam right over the reef. The sky, that had been so leaden and peaceful and like a solid roof, was now all in a hurry, flowing eastward like a great turbulent river in spate. And now, again, one could hear the sound in the distance, the thunder of the captains of the storm and the shouting, but still so faint, so vague, so indeterminate and unearthly that it seemed like the sound in a dream. Emmeline sat amidst the ferns on the floor, cowed and dumb, holding the baby to her breast. It was fast asleep. Dick stood at the doorway. He was disturbed in mind, but he did not show it. The whole beautiful island world had now taken on the color of ashes and the color of lead. Beauty had utterly vanished. All seemed sadness and distress. The cocoa palms, under the wind that had lost its steady rush and was now blowing in hurricane blasts, flung themselves about in all the attitudes of distress, and whoever has seen a tropical storm will know what a cocoa palm can express by its movements under the lash of the wind. Fortunately, the house was so placed that it was protected by the whole depth of the grove between it and the lagoon, and fortunately, too, it was sheltered by the dense foliage of the breadfruit, for suddenly, with a crash of thunder as if the hammer of Thor had been flung from sky to earth, the clouds split and the rain came down in a great slanting wave. It roared on the foliage above, which, bending leaf on leaf, made a slanting roof from which it rushed in a steady sheet-like cascade. Dick had darted into the house, and was now sitting beside Emmeline, who was shivering and holding the child, which had awakened at the sound of the thunder. For an hour they sat, the rain ceasing and coming again, the thunder shaking earth and sea, and the wind passing overhead with a piercing, monotonous cry. Then all at once the wind dropped, the rain ceased, and a pale spectral light, like the light of dawn, fell before the doorway. "It's over," cried Dick, making to get up. "Oh, listen," said Emmeline, clinging to him, and holding the baby to his breast as if the touch of him would give it protection. She had divined that there was something approaching worse than a storm. Then, listening in the silence, away from the other side of the island, they heard a sound like the droning of a great top. It was the center of the cyclone approaching. A cyclone is a circular storm, a storm in the form of a ring. This ring of hurricane travels across the ocean with inconceivable speed and fury, yet its center is a haven of peace. As they listened, the sound increased, sharpened, and became a tang that pierced the eardrums, a sound that shook with hurry and speed, increasing, bringing with it the bursting and crashing of trees, and breaking at last overhead in a yell that stunned the brain like the blow of a bludgeon. In a second the house was torn away, and they were clinging to the roots of the breadfruit, deaf, blinded, half lifeless. The terror and the prolonged shock of it reduced them from thinking beings to the level of frightened animals whose one instinct is preservation. How long the horror lasted they could not tell, when, like a madman who pauses for a moment in the amid of his struggles and stands stock still, the wind ceased blowing, and there was peace. The center of the cyclone was passing over the island. Looking up, one saw a marvelous sight. The air was full of birds, butterflies, insects, all hanging in the heart of the storm and traveling with it under its protection. Though the air was still as the air of a summer's day, from north, south, east, and west, from every point of the compass, came the yell of the hurricane. There was something shocking in this. In a storm one is so beaten about by the wind that one has no time to think. One is half stupefied. But in the dead center of a cyclone one is in perfect peace. The trouble is all around, but it is not here. One has time to examine the thing like a tiger in a cage, listen to its voice, and shudder at its ferocity. The girl, holding the baby to her breast, sat up gasping. The baby had come to no harm. It had cried at first when the thunder broke, but now it seemed impassive, almost dazed. Dick stepped from under the tree and looked at the prodigy in the air. The cyclone had gathered on its way seabirds and birds from the land. There were gulls, electric white and black man-of-war birds, butterflies, and they all seemed imprisoned under a great drifting dome of glass. As they went, traveling like things without volition and in a dream, with a hum and a roar the southwest quadrant of the cyclone burst on the island, and the whole bitter business began over again. It lasted for hours. Then towards midnight the wind fell, and when the sun rose next morning he came through a cloudless sky, without a trace of apology for the destruction caused by his children the winds. Chapter 17. The Stricken Woods. At first they thought they were ruined. Then Dick, searching, found the old saw under a tree, and the butcher's knife near it, as though the knife and saw had been trying to escape in company and had failed. Bit by bit they began to recover something of their scattered property. The remains of the flannel had been taken by the cyclone, and wrapped round and round a slender coconut tree, till the trunk looked like a gaily bandaged leg. The box of fishhooks had been jammed into the center of a cooked breadfruit, both having been picked up by the fingers of the wind and hurled against the same tree, and the staysail of the Shenandoah was out on the reef, with a piece of coral carefully placed on it as if to keep it down. As for the lug sail belonging to the dinghy, it was never seen again. There is humor sometimes in a cyclone, if you can only appreciate it. No other form of air disturbance produces such quaint effects. Beside the great main whirlpool of wind, there are subsidiary whirlpools, each actuated by its own special imp. Emmeline had felt Hannah nearly snatched from her arms twice by these little ferocious gimlet winds, and that the whole business of the great storm was set about with the object of snatching Hannah from her, and blowing him out to sea, was a belief which she held, perhaps, in the innermost recesses of her mind. The dinghy would have been utterly destroyed had it not heeled over and sunk in shallow water at the first onset of the wind. As it was, Dick was able to bail it out at the next low tide, when it floated as bravely as ever, not having started a single seam. But the destruction amidst the trees was pitiful. Looking at the woods as a mass, one noticed gaps here and there, but what had really happened could not be seen till one was amongst the trees. Great, beautiful coconut palms, not dead, but just dying, lay crushed and broken as if trampled upon by some enormous foot. you would come across half a dozen lianas twisted into one great cable. Where coconut palms were, you could not move a yard without kicking against a fallen nut. You may have picked up full-grown, half-grown, and wee baby nuts, not bigger than small apples, for on the same tree you will find nuts of all sizes and conditions. One never sees a perfectly straight-stemmed cocoa palm. They all have an inclination from the perpendicular more or less. Perhaps that is why a cyclone has more effect on them than on other trees. Artists, once so pretty a picture with their diamond-checkered trunks, lay broken and ruined, and right through the belt of Mammy Apple, right through the bad lands, lay a broad road, as if an army, horse, foot, and artillery had passed that way from lagoon edge to lagoon edge. This was the path left by the great forefoot of the storm, but had you searched the woods on either side, you would have found paths where the lesser winds had been at work, where the baby whirlwinds had been at play. From the bruised woods, like an incense offered to heaven, rose a perfume of blossoms gathered and scattered, of rain-wet leaves, of lianas twisted and broken and oozing their sap, the perfume of newly wrecked and ruined trees, the essence and soul of the ardu, the banyan and cocoa palm cast upon the wind. You would have found dead butterflies in the woods, dead birds too, but in the great path of the storm you would have found dead butterflies' wings, feathers, leaves frayed as if by fingers, branches of the ea, and sticks of the hibiscus broken into little fragments, powerful enough to rip a ship open, root up a tree, half ruin a city, delicate enough to tear a butterfly wing from wing. That is a cyclone. Emmeline, wandering about in the woods with Dick on the day after the storm, looking at the ruin of great tree and little bird, and recollecting the land birds she had caught a glimpse of yesterday being carried along safely by the storm out to sea to be drowned, felt a great weight lifting from her heart. Mischance had come and spared them and the baby. The blue had spoken, but had not called them. She felt that something, the something which we in civilization call fate, was for the present gorged, and, without being annihilated, her incessant hypochondriacal dread condensed itself into a point, leaving her horizon sunlit and clear. The cyclone had truly treated them almost, one may say, amiably. It had taken the house, but that was a small matter, for it had left them nearly all their small possessions. The tinder box and flint and steel would have been a much more serious loss than a dozen houses, for, without it, they would have had absolutely no means of making a fire. Chapter 18. A Fallen Idol. The next day Dick began to rebuild the house. He had fetched the staysail from the reef and rigged up a temporary tent. It was a great business cutting the canes and dragging them out in the open. Emmeline helped, whilst Hannah, seated on the grass, played with the bird that had vanished during the storm, but reappeared the evening after. The child and the bird had grown fast friends. They were friendly enough evening at first, but now the bird would sometimes let the tiny hands clasp him right round his body, at least, as far as the hands would go. It is a rare experience for a man to hold a tame and unstruggling and unfrightened bird in his hands, next to pressing a woman in his arms. It is the pleasantest tactile sensation he will ever experience, perhaps, in life. He will feel a desire to press it to his heart, if he has such a thing. Hannah would press Coco to his little brown stomach, as if in artless admission of where his heart lay. He was an extraordinarily bright and intelligent child. He did not promise to be talkative, for, having achieved the word Dick, he rested content for a long while before advancing further into the labyrinth of language. But though he did not use his tongue, he spoke in a host of other ways. With his eyes, that were as bright as Coco's and full of all sorts of mischief, with his hands and feet and the movements of his body. He had a way of shaking his hands before him when highly delighted, a way of expressing nearly all the shades of pleasure, and though he rarely expressed anger, when he did so, he expressed it fully. He was just now passing over the frontier into Toyland. In civilization he would no doubt have been the possessor of an India rubber dog or a woolly lamb, but there were no toys here at all. Emmeline's old doll had been left behind when they took flight from the other side of the island, and Dick, a year or so ago, on one of his expeditions, had found it lying half buried in the sand of the beach. He had brought it back now more as a curiosity than anything else, and they had kept it on the shelf in the house. The cyclone had impaled it on a tree twig nearby, as if in derision, and Hannah, when it was presented to him as a plaything, flung it away from him as if in disgust. But he would play with flowers or bright shells or bits of coral, making vague patterns with them on the sward. All the toy lambs in the world would not have pleased him better than those things, the toys of the troglodyte children, the children of the Stone Age. To clap two oyster shells together and make a noise, what, after all, could a baby want better than that? One afternoon, when the house was beginning to take some sort of form, they ceased work and went off into the woods, Emmeline carrying the baby, and Dick taking turns with him. They were going to the Valley of the Idol. Since the coming of Hannah, an evening before, the stone figure standing in its awful and mysterious solitude had ceased to be an object of dread to Emmeline, and had become a thing vaguely benevolent. Love had come to her under its shade, and under its shade the spirit of the child had entered into her, from where, who knows? But certainly through heaven. Perhaps the thing which had been the god of some unknown people had inspired her with the instinct of religion. If so, she was his last worshipper on earth, for when they entered the valley they found him lying upon his face. Great blocks of stone lay around him. There had evidently been a landslip, a catastrophe preparing for ages, and determined, perhaps, by the torrential rain of the cyclone.